For those of you just joining us, welcome to the CEC webinar, What's Different in the Special Education Assessment Process for English Learners? I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters, Dr. Claudia Rinaldi and Dr. Maria Serpa. Claudia Rinaldi, Ph.D., is an associate professor and chair of the education department at LaSalle College. Her research addresses the implementation of RTI and MTSS in urban settings and with English learners. She engages educators on how to improve systems and instructional practices for students with reading difficulties and those who are English learners and have disabilities. Maria Serpa, Ed.D., has 3 decades of experience with educational assessment of English learning students with and without disabilities. Dr. Serpa is Professor Emerita at Lesley University. She's the co-author of several publications in assessment and biliteracy, and her research focuses on non-discriminatory, culturally and linguistically responsive assessment of English language students with disabilities as biliteracy. Now, I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Claudia.
Good afternoon. This is Maria Serpa.
And we're really excited to be here. We also heard the type of attendants that are here, so welcome to everybody. We're grateful that you came to join us today, and we hope that the information that you're about to hear will be something that you could bring back to your teams and to your everyday work. We'll be looking at a few sections within the presentation. As you probably heard from Megan, but I'll say it again, the slides will be available to you, and we have included a couple of handouts as well as examples of data collection forms that could be helpful in the process of your jobs. We'll set up the context with some recent data that just came out on English learners and where we are. We'll look at some misconceptions. We'll actually test you for a couple minutes. And then we'll go into explaining how the 3 language learning laws will work together. Then we'll review some assessment requirements that are specific for English learners. And then, of course, the most fun part for us, which was our recommendations based on our research and experience in supporting districts and teacher preparation process. As we move forward today, I wanted to take an opportunity to kind of just review where we are, and this data that I'm about to talk about in a minute here is from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report that literally just came out this month in August. And what was really interesting about it was that sometimes we forget the numbers, but even though those numbers are small, these are probably the most challenging cases that teachers deal with on an everyday basis, and that state of education and district offices deal with reporting to the federal government. So English learners with disability constitute about 9% of all English learners and 8% of students with disabilities. And in their latest number, they reported about 350,000 students who are both English learners with disabilities. Did you know that about 3.5 more times English learners are likely to be placed in special education? So that is one of the challenges as to probably why you're here today. You know, when to refer English learners. Do we wait or do we start ahead of time? And the data is telling us that they are 3 more times more likely to be placed in special education if they are English learners as opposed to just bilingual learners. There is an under and overrepresentation of English learners who are bilingual learners in special education, depending on the area of disability. Most overrepresentation is in speech and language disabilities, as well as specific learning disabilities, but there are other areas where they are underrepresented. Students with limited use of their native language, which we call language 1 or L1, and their English, which would be their L2, are more likely to be found eligible for special education as well. And those are probably the toughest population of students to deal with, is when teachers tell us they don't know their first language and they don't know English either, and both are not making progress. So we definitely know a little bit more specifically who are these particular students that are having the most challenges in schools. The last did you know is the Department of Justice has found that the evaluation of ELs was overwhelmingly done in English, even though that was not the first language of the students. And as they report that, it brings up close to the work that we're doing here in Massachusetts, that this is exactly one of those things that is happening here as well. So the Department of Justice just came to the state, as it has done in many other states. And when we look at the data, what we're finding is that language is not even being considered in the referral and evaluation process of students who are referred for special education services. Maria, did you want to add something?
I think that this is a critical dimension of the assessment, because IDA 2006 does require assessment in the native language, but the practice does not support what the requirement from IDA 2006. And given the many perceptions and areas of knowledge regarding to the assessment of ELLs with disabilities, or dual language learners with disabilities, I would like to move us to the idea of taking a quiz. We would like to ask you to read the 4 statements and decide if they are true and false. We will then go from there.
So Megan will be throwing the questions in front of your screen in a poll format, and so you'll be able to answer, and then she'll report out how you're answering each of these 4 questions. The first one deals with a statement, and it's either true or false in each of these. Children who struggle in school get confused if they are learning 2 languages. So go ahead and answer that. And Megan, when you have a count, can you tell us?
Okay, we're looking, it's jumping. We've got about 75, 80% saying false and 20% saying true.
Okay, good. Let's move on to the next one, and we'll address that one in a little bit. There's a greater likelihood that if your child has intellectual disabilities or autism, that they will also have a language disability. True or false?
Okay, we're looking at about 80% true, 20% false.
Code switching means students are confused and should pick one language. Test in English. True or false?
Okay, looking at about 98% false on this one.
We must maximize times for learning English, including at home, so that the children with disabilities are not overloaded. True or false?
All right, and this one we're looking at about 70% false and 30% true.
Okay, great. So let's move on to look at some of the answers. So if you answered false to every item, you get 100%. If you didn't, we'll have some ideas here in the rest of the sessions that would help you kind of clarify some of those questions. So some of the misconceptions about learning English learners include children who struggle in school get confused that they're learning 2 languages. And there's actually no evidence, and multiple studies that have reported that there's no evidence that those with disabilities get confused or overwhelmed in learning multiple languages at one time, regardless of disability. There is no negative consequences in learning 2 languages. When we think about this, it is clear when we see it at home, children with even intellectual disabilities who are able to navigate both languages and using languages for different contexts. So, for example, you could have a child who at home has the language of home, for example, items in the home, foods in the home, and has no academic language, but in English has all academic language and more limited vocabulary. The limited vocabulary doesn't mean that they're confused or they're overloaded. It just means where their language is being used. At home is different use than at school. So they're building a repertoire of vocabulary used in different contexts, and they're not overwhelmed or confused. It's just wherever they're using the information. If we move up to the next one, there's a greater likelihood if your child has intellectual disability or autism, they would have also a language disability. And again, the studies that have looked at this show that these students with intellectual disability or autism spectrum disorders are at no greater risk than any other monolingual English speaking child with the same disorders. So many times we've heard and we've experienced teachers to tell parents to encourage them to speak in English to their children. And the challenge there is that then they're not being provided with the richness of the vocabulary within the context in which they're practicing both languages. So again, if you go back to my previous comment, you know, we're gaining language in every interaction that we do, whether it's at home, at school, and the children have different interactions at home about different types of vocabulary that they would have at home, but there's no confusion. They're able to learn both and are no greater risk for an additional disorder. Code switching means that students are confused and quickly should pick up one language, like test only in English. And even though we do have federal government and guidance, state guidance telling us that after a year, students must be tested in the state test, code switching should be embraced, because it's actually the ability of a child to be able to use language to speak and draw from both languages to communicate the critical knowledge that they're trying to do. So it's a problem-solving behavior that we actually encourage students to access the vocabulary in whatever language they're able to do so. This is important because often in the last 30 years, we've gone back and forth in the assessment process of whether we accept answers to the special education evaluation process in their native language or not. Do they get credit on IQ or achievement test or not? And so the idea here is, again, there is an interpersonal language and academic language that is depending on context, and children draw from both to be able to create the vocabulary that they need to communicate their message. We've also heard a lot that we must maximize times for learning English, including at home. And again, research suggests that less exposure to your native language and vocabulary in that native language is not effective for English learners in learning English. So again, the issue of transfer from one language to the other is more helpful as the child is building vocabulary. When we ask students to use families to use only English at home, we are limiting the vocabulary exposure that the students are giving, especially if the parents are limited English speaking. So really opening the world of vocabulary through interaction of interpersonal relationships within the family and extended family and community is very key for the children to add to their natural vocabulary and be able to then transfer that into their English skills. Maria, did you want to add anything on these?
Yes, I think this is an issue that is critically important that needs a clarification. In my personal experience, I never spoke with my daughter in English during school time, and she did very well in school. So the problem is not that parents speak their home language with their children at home. The problem is how, or I should say the challenge, is what we do in school to address their learning needs appropriately, which actually is what we are going to be addressing next in terms of the challenges that English learners with disabilities face when they have to learn a new language and adapt to a new culture and to experience the impact of disability. Success comes without a doubt faster with the high academic, social, and emotional support, and with caring educators who really understand the instruction for second language speakers, are very familiar with what the law requires, and are also well informed about the research that pertains directly to how do we teach students who are learning in English as a second language or as a new language. So when we look at this, it's critically important that we take a look at the current status in terms of laws. And we like to frame it this way, that in fact, civil rights is the foundation for special ed law and for language learning laws, but that is the intersection between language learning and special education segment, what we call ELL students with disabilities, that really are protected by the interaction of these three kinds of laws. One of them that pertains directly to the Supreme Court case that is so clear in terms of the message that there is no equity of treatment merely by providing students with the same facilities, the same textbooks, the same teachers, the same curriculum, because students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education because they, in fact, they cannot learn if they don't understand what's happening in instruction in the classroom.
So we've been asked to speak a little bit slower, so we're sorry about the speed. We're just very passionate about this, and we have so much to say that we want to make sure we get it in under the hour, but we'll definitely make a conscious effort. As we move on, one of the next areas that we're going to talk about are these particular laws. So I'll let Maria go ahead and continue.
Yes, particularly language learning education laws, meaning the laws that protect the rights of how students need to access and learn English. It comes in ESSA 2015, is really addressed in Title I and Title III. Initially, with No Child Left Behind was mainly Title III, and now the accountability issue does go to Title I, as it happens with everyone else. Then when we look at the special ed law, or laws and regulations, we are truly ensuring that students receive an appropriate education in the least restrictive environment, which is documented in the IEP. And this is a critical element as we look at English language learners with disabilities. What is different and additional when we also address the IEP? Because it is, for this population, it is really required that children receive language learning instruction because they do have language learning needs. And it is also required that they be part of a non-discriminatory assessment evaluation process. So the foundation of all of these two laws, kinds of laws, we have civil rights, the civil rights laws, which include Section 504. And these laws guarantee and regulate fundamental freedoms and protections for all students. And as we mentioned previously, Law versus Nichols clearly identifies that language barriers are really a critical issue that needs to be addressed when we address English learners with disabilities and without disabilities.
So in many of our work, as we have helped teachers and districts and administrators and school state officials, ask is, does one trump the other? And what is clear in this law is we have to address both. So one of our biggest messages today is to think about how collaboration could happen in more effective ways, not only for assessment, but also for instruction and intervention. Since one cannot trump the other, but both it should interrelate and work together to provide the best education or the most appropriate education for these particular students. We'll move into talking a little bit more about Title I and Title III before we move on to more of the assessment requirements. And this hopefully also coming from a special ed perspective will fill in some of the bilingual education legal requirements under ESSA and clarify that since part of our special education constituency is more on the special ed side than the bilingual education side.
So Title I requires that English language proficiency standards be addressed and that they be aligned to a state's academic content standards. It also requires that an annual English language development assessment that is aligned with the standards required And this is in the accountability system. And this is a great development because now everyone is on the same page in understanding that language learners are also entitled to achieve at grade level and benefit from instruction at grade level. Now, Title III maintains a separate funding stream dedicated to the education of English learners, and that still is similar to what happened before with No Child Left Behind.
Some school districts around the country are now blending these supports to bring together teacher teams that include the general education professional, the special education professional, and the ESL or English language learner or bilingual education professional to come and work together and make benefit of the training that they need for this separate funding dedicated for English learners. This is particularly important because the number of English learners continues to rise and the needs of all bilingual learners continues to rise as well, even in the combination of both that have the English learner needs plus special education.
Title III also requires the sub-grantees to report to the state a description of the language programs and activities, the number and percent of ELL students, and very important, the reporting of ELL students with disabilities is included, in addition to making progress, attaining English proficiency, being reclassified, meeting academic standards for each of the 4 years after they have been reclassified, which actually is different from No Child Left Behind, which would include only 2 years. And also the inclusion of those who have not reached English proficiency after 5 years that are usually called long-term ELs. It also requires the use of annual meaningful difference, the AMD instead of the AYP. If you would like more information on that, we recommend that you really take a look at the law because that's a very specific requirement for all learners of English in the different states.
So I wanted to just kind of restate the 2 main points in red in this slide, which is that we need to report the students who are English learners with identified disabilities. And I think this is where the interest in looking at this population is coming, and probably one of the reasons why some of you are here in particular. For example, in some of the districts we've worked with here in as a state that does not support bilingual education right now, that the number of students in urban school districts has more than doubled of those who are English learners with disabilities. And so that is one of the reasons that the Department of Justice has come in to look at what is happening with those numbers. And this will continue to happen as we don't address the needs of this population correctly and we don't identify correctly. I wanted to take just a moment to ask if there were any questions related to the specific issues that we've addressed right now before we move into the assessment requirements. So Megan, if you have any questions, could you share those with us?
I don't know if this is exactly what we just talked about, but will we be talking about special education assessment of English learners with significant cognitive disabilities?
Good, that's a great question. So we don't specify any particular area of disability. And one of the things that is our message for today's webinar is about the process of evaluation and how we can make that better. So even though it's not specific for cognitive disabilities, I think you'll find the checklist that we've provided and the tools on data collection very effective for any kind of disability. Okay, so I hope that helps. So let's just, again, make sure that we all understand, because many times when we work with individuals in the field, I get the question, I can't do this, or I can't do that, or I have to use the Woodcock-Johnson, or I have to do this. And so we really want you to have a tool to take back to your school districts and to your offices and say, what are really truly the requirements? So we'll move into what are the current actual requirements and give you some place to be able to go back to and find that. In 2015, the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, identified what they call principles of fewer and smarter assessments. And part of this is really key because we spend between 6 to 9 hours of time dealing with an evaluation of a student who's referred to special education. And we want to make sure that it's high quality and it's time limited so as to not remove the child more than needed, but that it's also fair and supports fairness and an equity of educational opportunity. So we wanted to make sure that you had this under your belt to be able to kind of think about what the process currently looks in your schools, in your school districts, in your state, and be able to kind of review exactly what makes it high quality with some of the recommendations we'll be starting in a couple of minutes. It also talks about fully transparent process for students and parents. And a lot of what we found is that we skipped some of those very low-hanging fruit kind of activities that gives us the most information that is helpful into making the decision whether a child who's an English learner is eligible for special education services. And then the last part is how it's tied to improved learning. So are we really developing IEPs that are not blanket equal IEPs for everybody that is referred to special education, but are we really making individualized learning plans for the students in the IEP that address both language and academics, as the laws have told us that they need to be addressing both. So some of the legal requirements under IDEA are as follows, and we've highlighted the green, and Maria will talk a little bit more about those.
Yes. I think it's very important, and we all know that we need to use a variety of assessment tools and strategies to really gather the information. This does not mean tests necessarily. It means different kinds of tools. And I think that's an important thing to have in mind, because in many school districts, the focus is primarily on testing and not on assessment tools and strategies as a whole. And it's important to review that, in fact, IDEA does say use a variety of assessment tools and strategies. It also says do not use only a single measure or assessment. Applies to absolutely everyone. Critically to this issue is what language should be used for assessment in eligibility, and the requirement is that assessments must be administered so as not to be discriminatory, and they must be administered in a child's native language or other mode of communication, meaning in the form that most likely will yield accurate information. This is probably one of the most ignored, if you will, part of the requirements, because one of the emphasis quite often is on using testing, and they are not available in the native language of the student. So now, given that we have the freedom to use a variety of assessment tools, and there are so many, we can do a better job in terms of how we assess in the native language as well as in English. And of course, any assessment must be valid and reliable, and it must be administered by trained and knowledgeable personnel. And here we have a challenge, because there is a shortage of individuals who are trained in assessment, who also are trained in how to carry out assessments in the home language or mode of communication. Anything you'd like to add, Claudia?
Yeah, so when we talk about a single measurement or assessment, I also wanted to add that in many districts, the special education office or the school psychology department purchases a set minimal number of tools. And I think it's always important to kind of revisit what is available for school psychologists and for special educators, and be able to update the test as needed. That is an investment that not only is an investment in your professionals that are working for you, but on making sure and ensuring that the tests itself are not, that are valid and reliable to the best possible way, and this would be for all students. Additionally, training, it's also important to go beyond just training of particular tests, but training in assessment processes are key. And we're going to talk about one just in a couple minutes that we really feel is a really great tool for addressing English learners who are referred for special education evaluation. The last thing I wanted to share in this slide is that if you think about the process of special education evaluation and eligibility, it is a subjective process as much as we like to look at numbers. It is a subjective process, and it is a group decision process that involves the parent. So not a single sole criterion should be used for making that decision, because every team will have a different decision potentially. As you know, a child might qualify in one state and not in another, and a child may qualify in one district and not another. One example is, for example, in Wisconsin, they used to have a formula by which a severe discrepancy was used for children with learning disabilities. In most states did not have a formula, so there was no cutoff number, and that's one simple example. In other states, they require, for example, in California and San Diego Unified, they require that a checklist that involves multiple aspects of what we'll be talking in a couple minutes are addressed before you can move into making a determination of eligibility. So again, I think sometimes we're in a rush to kind of think about, you know, the numbers, when in reality the focus, particularly for English learners, because we don't have tools in many languages that are there, and because eligibility is not based on a test but on an assessment and evaluation process, that we don't jump to conclusions that one test is going to give us the answer. It's a process of data collection that will. As we move forward, I'm just moving my pointer. Other requirements under IDEA for evaluations and reevaluations is reviewing the existing evaluation data of the child that includes the information provided for parents by the parents of this child. Many times with some of what we're seeing here is the parents are not interviewed for many of the things that we'll suggest in a minute. But you know, in the case of, for example, my child, myself, who was evaluated for giftedness, nobody questioned me to ask whether the child was actually bilingual or not. So when we came for the eligibility meeting, they did not know that my child was bilingual. And this was not a problem. This was, you know, kind of entering somebody who was recommended for gifted services. So imagine if we're on the opposite end of the spectrum and we think that a child has a disability, whether it be intellectual disability or autism or, you know, any other kind of disability. We need to ensure that the evaluation process includes input from the parent on all aspects that provide us with the ability to make a more and better informed decision about eligibility. The evaluation process should also include current-based local and state assessments and classroom-based observations. That is part of the law. Observations by teacher and related service providers, and we've included a sample of those in one of the handouts. Again, the examples are just our vision and what we've used over the past to work with teachers and administrators. So this is just examples, but you could certainly create your own, and there's many school districts that have some good examples. But the question is whether we're using them to collect information on what the students are able or not able to do, and in multiple classrooms. So depending on what the challenge is, and for example, if a child is referred for reading difficulty, are we observing the child in the natural environment, collecting data on that observation, and are we also evaluating the child and observing them in a different classroom where perhaps a different teaching strategy is being used, and there's a better response or better interaction by the child, and so we're able to see whether it's an issue of high quality instruction or it's truly an issue of disability, particularly for English learners who tend to be more quieter in the classroom. Maria, do you have anything to add about observations?
Yes, I think that when educators are doing observations of students who are English learners for eligibility or for reevaluation, it's very important that the observation be culturally responsive. That means anyone can do an observation, but they may not be the person who evaluates the data that is collected. And that's something that we will address in just a minute.
We do have a question that came up, which is with some students without bilingual assessors in those areas of the country, we don't have that, or new languages that continue to come in our schools. It's often a translator is used, and then can you have the scores not valid? What other tools would you be suggesting? So again, remember that it's not, when you're doing data collection, it's not about the score that you get, but the compilation of all the information that you're gathering about the student before you make that eligibility decision. So again, it's reframing the special education assessment as the result of test scores and moving into a conversation about where the child is performing across all the areas of the context in which they live in, and what all the information, or an ecological perspective of where the child fits. We're going to move to specific, just one slide on specific learning disabilities, because this is the most happening right now. And the particular area that is clear here is that IDEA does state that they must not require the use of severe discrepancy between intellectual ability and achievement for determining whether the child has specific learning disability. And they also must permit the uses of process based on the child's responsiveness to scientific and research-based intervention in models such as response to intervention or multi-tier systems of support. This is important again because I think this particular population needs to move your school psychologists and special educators, is to move them away from formulas that kind of get a lot of the training from teachers that have been in the field for 15 years at least, and moving them more into learning about who the child is ecologically and how they interact in all aspects of the school experience, and whether the difficulty is seen across all subjects and across both languages, and make a more informed decision about the impact of identifying a child with a disability. Well, I want to just take a little breather here and ask if there are any other questions or clarifications that you might want at this point. So Megan, do we have any?
I see someone has their hand raised. If you want to type your question in that chat box, that would be great. But at the moment, we don't have any questions.
Okay, so we're going to move to the part that you've really been waiting for, because this is where the richness of that conversation and of shifting the paradigm of the conversation from test scores to an evaluation process comes in. And the first thing that we recommend is to have a representative team of professionals that develop an individualized assessment plan. What is an individualized assessment plan? You might have heard of the IEP, but maybe not the IAP. And that is a recommended practice where the team comes together and they look at the problem as to why the child was referred and create a plan of assessment and evaluation to gather the data from an ecological perspective, looking at the whole child based on that question as to whether the child was referred. So oftentimes what happens is the children are referred to special education, school psychologist comes in, special educator, they do their thing, and then we meet. Here what we're recommending is that the team sits ahead of time, including the English as a second language teacher or bilingual teacher, and add their perspective as to what the evaluation process or assessment process should include, and that we don't forget these aspects that you'll see in a checklist in a few minutes, that we need to include information from the parents about various areas that inform the processes as to why this child may be having challenges. So what is different for ELLs? Okay, so I've been kind of throwing the term ecological evaluation. And so the idea here is we're doing data collection. We want to know what the child knows, what the child can do. We want to see it. And then we want to come together and think about whether these practices or these challenges are impeding learning in multiple languages, in just one language, in high quality classrooms or in low quality classrooms, before we make a determination. We also want to be able to have a conversation about whether different interventions and instructional practices work better. So for English learners, what the research is telling us that is that classrooms are mostly the teacher standing in front and teaching for about 80% of the time, whereas the research suggests for learning language, there should be more oracy involved. The word oracy involves the use of interpersonal and academic language during an academic language activity. So peer-mediated learning and an ability to be actively engaged in learning rather than a passive receiver of learner when the child is sitting in their desk. Will not only help English language development, but it would help to be able for the child to learn from multiple modalities and multiple personnel, teacher and other peers, about the content of the language that they're being taught. So we want to be able to also then think about whether these students are receiving different types of interventions in small groups, in one-on-one, and that what the response is in that capacity and not only in whole classroom instruction. In part of this, we want to identify whether the child is demonstrating progress. So progress monitoring as part of a multi-tier system of support, it's really key. That's the indicator, the red flag that lets us know whether we should be more concerned. Usually in this framework, we are having already small group intervention happening or computer-based interventions happening. And so if we're monitoring, we are already collecting data about what works best for these students, which is a much more effective way of bringing that ecological assessment together when a child is referred for special education. The aspect of data collection also includes formal and informal assessments and learning and understanding the different types of assessments. So we have standards-based assessments, we have curriculum-based assessments, which are mostly used for, again, the MTSS models that are out there, in which it gives you an indication. And then there is the third one, which is the diagnostic tools that will tell us more specifically if there is a red flag. The diagnostic will tell us in which particular area of reading and math. The last part that you see in the screen is the information collected from parents. And we want to learn, again, what language is spoken at home, what cultural background is typical for the children, particularly when we're seeing so many different cultures coming into our districts and we may know one better than other. We want to collect a health history, because health from childhood can impact reading and learning. So we want to be able to know that health history, but also educational history. And again, in my career over the last 25 years, we used to see this as a default where we were training school psychologists and special educators to do this kind of histories, but less and less because of time constraints, we're seeing this happen. So we're not really gaining a whole picture of the students. So the problem with testing is something that Maria is very passionate about, and she has this quote that she'll read, and that really goes along with the picture that you see here, and I'm sure you've all seen this picture. And part of the process is thinking about whether we see the old lady or the young, beautiful girl that is in this picture here.
Yes, because in my experience over 30 years, I see that the problem is not with a test or other assessment tool, but it's with the evaluation, meaning the interpretation of the results. And to do that, we really need to have evaluators who are culturally and linguistically informed in terms of how to make sense of the data that is being collected. I should say that a test score is only an indicator, but a test score that is really done for a learner of English quite often is invalid, and I'm of the opinion that one should not even report it. So summing up, the problem definitely is not with the testing or with the assessment tool, but indeed with how do we evaluate the data that we are really gathering.
One of the things that you had in your questions that came in as we were talking was how do we use, I'm sorry, I'm going to bring it up here. What other tools would you be suggesting? So we're going to move into that and think about the interpretation of the results. When we talk about test scores, and oftentimes we feel like we have to really have this test scores rather than the interpretation of the results and the whole data collection process. So it is really important to go back and think about the law that we just said, and nowhere does it say there that we need to focus on the test scores. We need to focus on the information that was gathered, and that this is, again, a team decision that includes the parents in making that determination as to whether the special education services would be best for this particular student. So here are some 5 major things that I want you to take with you as to when you're conducting that evaluation process. One is that we need to plan for appropriate expertise and knowledge of the team making this eligibility decision. So you need the parents, and you also need the bilingual educator that be part of this team. Each teacher in the building teaches in a different format. Your general educators tend to do more of the whole group. Your ESL teachers or your bilingual educators work in different ways to capitalize on different areas. The special educator works in smaller numbers. So everybody needs to be part of the team to create that assessment and data collection process. We must also ensure that there's culturally responsive general education of Tier 1 that includes English as a second language support or bilingual education. So what we're seeing here is that if one trumps the other, the children are not getting ESL supports or bilingual education. And so what we want to make sure is that when we provide an intervention or additional support, that the service on the IEP is not now ESL support, but that's actually part of the general curriculum, and they continue to have access to what the general curriculum for those students are, which is with ESL support or bilingual education. The next piece is ensuring that there's effectiveness of Tier 2 and 3 interventions with appropriate progress monitoring. And there was a question that came up on appropriate progress monitoring. Appropriate progress monitoring for children receiving additional to Tier 1 and ESL, but additional to that, Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions, or one or both, is to monitor progress monthly or weekly, depending on the severity, Tier 2 or Tier 3. And the monitoring needs to be done in the academic sense, so reading monitoring or math monitoring, but also in language. And WIDA, which is what about 25 of the 50 states are using right now, provides some can-do indicators that I'll show you in a minute of how we can monitor progress monthly using that WIDA can-do indicators in terms of reading, writing, listening, and speaking, in addition to curriculum-based measures that, again, provide us just an indicator of whether we're making small progress over time. Number 4 is ensuring that the appropriateness of academic assessments and interpretation of the evaluation process is not just a test score. And then the last item, so we talked a little bit about that, but the last item may be new to some of you, and that is the ability to compare to local normative samples and a true peer comparison. What we mean with local normative examples is for those low incidence populations of students from very diverse populations that come and settle in a particular area, and we don't have any other students. So it could be students from Croatia and you have a bigger population populating in your district, and you need to be able to create some local normative sample of how these students are making progress. One of those ways is to be able to find a true peer comparison. So oftentimes teachers find themselves comparing students to your average child. But an English learner this cannot be compared to an average child who's monolingual. So finding a true peer comparison is finding a peer that matches in as many factors as we can. For example, reason of migration, socioeconomic status, number of years in the country, family composition, English language level, and many others that you could think about that would help in really being able to compare one student to the other student and seeing whether the progress of the child who was referred to special education was significantly different to be able to justify special education services and a change in his educational experience. As moving on, I know there's a couple questions, so we're going to address those questions right at the end. The ecological assessment is, again, picking information back from the student, taking information on When did they learn first language and second language? Are they simultaneous bilinguals, or are they learning one language and then they learn both languages at the same time? In the case of my children, they learned English, both languages equally at the same time. Collecting an education, medical history, socioeconomic status, parents' goals is something that we don't really usually ask parents, and which is key. So depending on the parents' goal for their child, is really important that we ask what the goals for the child is. For example, in the case of myself, the goals for my child is to become bilingual and biliterate. So I found educational programs that would allow us to do that. And this should be the same question that is asked for any child, any parent that has a child who is an English learner. For some parents is, just learning English, where for some parents is maintaining their goal, their native language, and we should be able to value and understand what their goal and motivation for bringing their child and dealing through the migration from one country to the other, if that's the case, or if they were born here, where do they see, whether they live in a macrocosm of their community, where, for example, Spanish is speaking here in the East Boston area or in the Miami-Dade County area, and they want their children to be bilingual and biliterate to be able to live in their community and be effective, rather than maybe if you live in rural Wisconsin, where English is more the dominant language for interaction in their community. And then the aspect of true peers. The idea of also ecological assessment I shared before was informal and formal assessment. And here, one of the key points is looking at informal assessment at grade level and the individual level. So you may have a child who's a 5th grader whose individual reading level is, let's say, a 3rd grade, but you want to measure the 3rd grade where they are to make sure that they're making small progress towards moving up or 3rd grade, but you also want to track at grade level so that we ensure that there is individual growth for that particular child, and the child doesn't always look like they're failing when compared to grade level. We need to monitor progress, and that is one way to monitor progress, is at the individuals and the individual learning level. We talked a little bit about non-discriminatory assessment and monitoring of language and academic reading and math and content areas, so we'll continue to do that in a minute.
Another recommendation that we would like to make is for schools and educators to develop and use cultural and linguistic briefs related to the families. In our experience, we make sure that our teachers, speech and language school psychologists become very familiar with the cultural background of the students that they are assessing, so they can better evaluate their performance. So on the culture brief, due to time, I'm not going to talk about the details, other than saying that understanding cultural differences is critical to really see what they're doing, what does it mean in the context of the culture that they come from. And this sort of connects also with the linguistic factors, because we all need to know the components of the native language and how it influences English. We need to be aware that organization and logic is different across different languages. And for example, I grew up with, and I was socialized academically with, connecting lots of ideas. It was not subordinating ideas. I've seen many international students do the same thing, and they are misevaluated as being disorganized, when in fact, what they're really doing is showing their logic from the cultural context that they are really coming from. And here is an example of how the problem is not with the test or with the assessment, but really with evaluation. How are we interpreting or judging what they are really doing? And of course, this would apply to oral communication as well as writing. And as we really look at the linguistic and cultural factors, for anyone who would like more information, there is a resource at the end. That is the Ed.D project website, where we have already some of this work done that you can use for your reference.
From Puerto Rico, Cambodia, Portugal, and Brazil to understand those backgrounds, and then you could build that as the cultures that you're seeing in your district. I know we have a question about how you could do adequate progress monitoring and meet required timelines in 45 days, and that's an excellent question. That question guides me back to multi-tier systems of support as being part of the school process of providing instruction and intervention for students, so that is part of the regular process of data collection. One of the things that you can also do if your school is not doing MTSS is to use a curriculum-based measure and use it on a weekly basis, or also think about what we used to use in special education, which is mastery learning. So mastery learning allows us to make sure that we don't move from one lesson to the other until they reach a certain percentage, 90 to 95, and track the number of days that it's taking the child to do that. So those are some ways to collect progress monitoring data. Next, I wanted to share a little bit about a checklist that is available in your handouts. This is just one picture of the first section, but it's really what should we be doing as we put together that evaluation process. Did we check all the aspects of what has been discussed in this presentation in terms of a child who's an English learner? What other additional information should we be thinking, particularly for these students, and how and who gets that information to bring back to the team? Another aspect that we want you to consider, and again, this is a 1-hour webinar where we have about 2 minutes, but we'll be staying for some questions, is to adopt a dynamic assessment data collection process. And dynamic assessment is an assessment process inspired by social cultural theory of Vygotsky, and where the assessment is part of a teaching method. And if you look at the Speech and Language Therapists Association, ASHA, they have some really great videos that show exactly how to do it. And the aspect of it is pre-testing the child. So if the child was referred for reading difficulty and unable to learn letters, for example, we can create an assessment, informal assessment, where you provide the child with letters. We teach them through a mediated learning experience, and then we retest to ensure that we know how the child is learning. And the question here is, with or without language, you could see whether the child is able to learn what you're teaching. Oftentimes we hear a lot from general educators, and I'm sure you can relate to this, is, well, I've tried everything and it doesn't work. So the idea of dynamic assessment is really finding the way that these children learn because of the cultural and linguistic differences, and how we can embed those practices as part of the general education curriculum and universal design for learning in terms of those principles of how to be and provide a high quality instruction. The next form that we wanted to share with you was a form that that allows us to collect data from observations in the general education classroom, at home, or also in the ESL bilingual classroom, and I'll let Maria kind of talk about that one.
Yes, and this is organized in the way that anyone can do the observation, but not everyone can really evaluate what they are really observing. And so this is one more tool that I think is very helpful in going from assessment to evaluation through observation. If we had more time, we would go into a deeper description of what this entails, but you will have in one of the handouts an example.
Completed example.
A completed example, so that can really be helpful. I've been using this for over 35 years, and it has made a significant difference in terms of partnering with people in the assessment team to really see who can do the observation and then who can interpret. Sometimes we definitely do need to get the advice of 2 people from the culture where this is coming from, and consult with someone who understands and is familiar with the research on second language acquisition. Anything else you would like to add?
No, and I think, you know, what I love about this form is that it makes you go back to the reason the child was referred for special education. Again, oftentimes that gets lost in translation. So we refer a child because they're not making progress, but we don't really have a picture of what is not making progress. In what areas? Is it in every area? Is it in reading? In what part of reading? And so asking those questions and seeing that interaction happening in the classroom, it's really key, and this is one way to collect that information. The next recommendation is to engage the team in conducting multiple culturally responsive observations. And again, we're looking for high quality instruction. Is it addressing active engagement? Again, I repeated this a little bit earlier, but teacher in more traditional classes, and I'm not saying all, so this is just what research reports, spend about 80% of time teaching students in passive learning compositions. Our recommendation is for teachers to try out a more actively engaged structure where students are actively interacting using oracy, and I referred to that earlier. The use of academic literacy, whether math or reading, activities that use interpersonal exchanges in the classroom. And the teacher then facilitates, again, creating a language-rich classroom where interpersonal academic language is growing on a daily basis. And we provided some guidance on how to do that observation. So you could go in and observe for 15 minutes, and you're looking at how long the target student is engaged in groups, how long they're engaged alone. You could even compare a true peer. And did the child even have an opportunity to respond to peers and teacher available? And you could do some frequency counts. And again, the idea here is to make sure that we're making the decision whether a child has a disability, if the child is not receiving the appropriate instruction, or should we be focusing on the type of instruction that creates active engagement, language-rich engagement, and that helps the child to develop language in a much quicker and much effective way, supported by the research. This form then allows you to engage the team in collecting English language development student data, so progress monitoring, the last question we had. How can I do adequate progress monitoring? This form is brought together. The R1, R2, and R3s are WIDA can-do indicator language, and I just added the months across. And the richness of this is that you can have all the teachers that work with the child complete this to ensure that in classrooms where there's small group instruction versus large group instruction and high quality instruction as well as low quality instruction, that we're seeing different aspects of what the child can do. And that's why I love the can-do indicators. So again, all we did was we went to the WIDA website, or you could do a Google search for WIDA can-do indicators. They're broken down by age level, by grade level, and they're broken down actually in different ways now in terms of academic functions. And you have the student, the teachers, and the team complete what they have observed this child be able to do and how their language is making progress it could be on a monthly basis. The last is a recommendation and the comparison of the true peer. And again, this was to kind of give you just a summary again of what a true peer represents as students who we can use as part of the assessment process that could be an appropriate and equal comparison to the target student. So you could look at language proficiency, culture, experiential background, age and time in the United States, acculturating to a new environment, use of language 1 at home, language 2, its similar educational experience and educational services such as, do they both attend a dual language school? Do they attend bilingual, transitional bilingual instruction, or just ESL services, or more of a monolingual approach, which is sheltered English instruction? So again, this is a good way to know whether your target student has a disability or not, or is the result of poor instruction in the classroom, which is one of those exclusionary clauses in the identification of any disability. So one of the things that we know is that
no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. Albert Einstein did point this very important idea that we really would like to bring to a close this webinar with the understanding that in fact we do need to think of alternative ways of addressing and fixing, if you will, what is happening currently with the assessment of ELLs or English learners with disabilities who are referred for special education.
Now, at the conclusion here, you may also wonder and say, well, how can I really do this? Or you gave a lot of ideas, but now how do I implement them? So our emails are available if you wanted to talk a little bit more specifically with each of us or with both of us at the same time. But I also want you to think that you may also be feeling frustrated and saying, well, there's no way I could do this. It would take too much time. And the question back to you, if you are feeling that, is, are you happy with the way the process is happening now? Are you still over-identifying? And what can you do ethically to make sure that we're not putting children in programs that may not be for their benefit and that could be the result of poor instruction or teachers who don't know how to do cultural responsiveness instruction in their classroom? So I'll just leave you with that thought. We did add a couple other resources. One is acronyms that you may or may not be familiar with, that you may see. So we wanted to share those from the bilingual side. As most of you are, of course, from the special education school psychology side. And we also wanted to provide you with the detail of the IDEA regulations that you could read in your leisure time, probably when you're ready to go to sleep, because they'll put you to sleep, but it's a good review. And lastly, we wanted to thank you. This was a great opportunity for us to share the work that we've been doing and to feel that we can make and plant a little seed in doing things differently. Maria and I work together, and we have the same mission to at least open a different way of supporting English learners. We also co-developed a certificate program of 6 credits via 4 classes at LaSalle College, which is 100% online. So I am doing a little promotion here of our teaching bilingual English learners with disabilities certificate at the graduate level. It's 100% online, so you could do it from wherever you are in the US or internationally. And again, I'm gonna thank you for coming, and I'll let Maria do the same.
I also would say thank you so much for participating in this webinar as we work together to promote equity in the assessment of students who speak a language other than English and who also may have a disability.
Thank you so much. We'll take questions now. If there's anybody who wants to stay, we can certainly stay for a few more minutes on questions.
Okay, so I saw some good questions come through in the chat box. If you guys do have questions, feel free to type them now, or you do have our presenters' email addresses right there, and they'll be happy to answer those after the live broadcast is over. And Claudia, do you have those questions?
So I have a question about the cognitive disabilities. I think we addressed with some students with a bilingual assessor, it's difficult to use native language. Often a translator is used, and then can the scores then be invalid? So I think that's an interesting question. So there are some programs around the US that train their translators in the terminology of the testing, of academics and special education. So I think it's really important when we do use translators to focus on whether they know the terminology as they're working with the student and as they're working as an interpreter for the family as well. So we want people who have some level of training, because as you know, in education, we throw out a lot of acronyms and a lot of assumptions that lay people may not know. Whether the scores are valid or not, again, it all depends. Maria's perspective is that we don't actually use any scores in any of the tests because it would not be valid, but every test gives us information on what the child is able and not able to do. So for example, if a child was referred to you because comprehension was an issue, and as part of giving your assessment test, and there's the use of a translator, they're able to see that the child can actually understand and answer questions that relate to the comprehension of a story, for example. That is one way for us to know that it's not that the child doesn't understand, it's just that they don't understand in the language that you've been teaching in the classroom. But with the additional supports of ESL, they are understanding listening. So the language of listening is coming in English, even though they still have to respond in speaking their native language. So that's one example. Do you have another example?
Yes, I think that when testing is the mode of gathering assessment data, that yes, I do not believe in giving standard scores, percentile ranks, etc. But I think we can collect descriptive data, and it is really important to qualitatively describe what they can do in comparison to the norming group where the test was developed, but it is not appropriate to actually make an interpretation as if this student is represented in the norming group of the original test that was originally developed in English with an English-speaking norming population.
Right. If we move to the next question, what exactly should be included in an academic report compiled by a special ed teacher versus what is in a psych general ability report? That's a fabulous question. So one of the things that I would include is your interview and observations for the interview with the parents about those areas that we recommended here in terms of cultural and linguistic factors. I would also include the summary of the observations and your interpretation of those if you are the one interpreting those observations. Your experience in doing dynamic assessment mediated learning experience as to what the child is able to do, and how you would select what to do is based on the question of referral. So again, if the question of referral was the child doesn't seem to have any reading comprehension, then your observation is all looking at how the child does reading comprehension in the observations, in your interaction during a dynamic assessment, and even through an assessment tool that you may be using but not reporting scores, but using the reading comprehension portions of those to have questions at grade level. You could also use information as to where the child is comprehending using informal reading inventories in that mediated learning, and providing experiences where the child is able to use language supports, since they're English learners, such as a word bank, cognate words, and the ability to answer their native language and record how is it that you get this information for children, not that they just can't do it.
An additional factor has to do with adding an assessment report on oral English proficiency, as well as the 4 domains, the other 3 domains, which would be understanding, speaking, reading, and writing in English as a second or a new language.
There was a question also of, have you compiled any samples of ecological assessments for English language learners? I would love to see an example. So if you can email us that, we're happy to provide you with some examples of that. So yes, absolutely. We could definitely provide you with some information. So feel free to email us. The next question deals with, we've previously used many types of assessment and pieces of data to build a profile of the student, and the parent could not move past the scores. As we review assessments and share information, should we not include the scores? Yes, that would make us very happy, and it kind of forwards the perspective that we've put here about the referral process being very subjective, and that it needs to be decided by a team of professionals that includes the parents. So if you feel that's gonna interfere with the conversation for the parents, then I think it is really important that you use what the child can do in terms of all the other tools that we showed, and in terms of artifacts from the classrooms to be able to show what the child can and cannot do, rather than focused on IQ test scores or achievement scores and where they fall, again, for the same reason that Maria said, which is that those scores are compared to a population that may or may not include the particular student. What if there's no true peer for a student? I get that a lot. So if there happens to be this lonely soul of this poor child who has no other background similarity to anybody else, I encourage you to reach out to the next door district, be able to see if you could go and observe some of their students that may be of that population. I would also inquire if maybe we just haven't asked. So I rarely have seen where we don't have a peer comparison. We may not be able to match on many factors, but you could certainly match on more factors, and think of it as, even if we don't match in as many factors, we're at least seeing a diverse student and how they're responding to teaching, and compare that to your target student, rather than comparing them to a monolingual English student who has a completely different experience. So I would, again, my experience is that a lot of teachers don't even know that some of their students are bilingual or from a different culture. We just make a lot of assumptions. So I really encourage you to have the general educator think about how to communicate with parents very closely and embrace the idea of various cultures in your classroom so that we do know the language and cultural backgrounds, and you could potentially have a true peer identified when we thought there was not one. Should the true peer be typically developing? Yes, we would like that, unless it is a cognitive disability, so the true peer can sit in a classroom. You could compare a true peer that is typically developing and let's say a true peer for what we think the child is. So let's say if there's intellectual disability, we could go to an intellectual disability student and evaluate and then compare the two true peers and then see where that child falls in that spectrum of the evaluation that you're doing. Should we take into account outside doctors who label students intellectually disabled or with a communication disorder upon initial meeting? It typically happens with newly adopted students. That's a great question. I don't know if Maria has any ideas. I have not encountered that. My expertise and experience would tell me that you read that report and add it to the ecological assessment of what you're also collecting, so that again, the doctor may have seen the student for 1 or 2 times for 20, 30 minutes at a time, and you could share with the parents what the child can and cannot do based on the context of different classrooms dealing with different teachers as they make the transition through their adoption process. What norms assessments can I use in Spanish? So yes, Spanish covers about 70% of students who are English learners in the United States. There are a couple of normed assessments, but again, I want to urge you to think beyond what these assessments can give you to an overall look at the collection of an ecological assessment process. The Bateria 3 has a Spanish aspect to it. But again, I feel like if the child, let's say, comes from Chile or Nicaragua, it may not have a representative sample. So even though it was normed on a variety of Spanish speakers, it may still not be representative of their culture. It's kind of if you could compare, you know, just because you speak Portuguese, people from Portugal and from Brazil, probably very different experiences culturally and linguistically. So again, can we change the paradigm of thinking about assessment as a test and rather as part of an evaluation process instead? So I think this answers all the questions, Megan, unless something else is coming in. These were great questions.
No,
and I hope our answers are helpful.
It looks like that's it for the questions, and as mentioned, both presenters' email addresses are up there on the screen right now, so please feel free to send them an email privately because we are out of time. I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and so much thanks to Dr. Rinaldi and Dr. Serpa for their time and expertise.
Thank you, Megan. We really